Hello, everybody. So a little bit of background before I jump into the case study. My background education was kind of in architecture and urban design. So I came from kind of this built environment lens. You might have seen from the social design core concepts that it seems maybe a little graphic design heavy, but this broader definition of design and kind of how does problem solving and creative problem solving into solutions is kind of what I brought to, I guess, the social design program and kind of what happened. And so through that, my work really started actually with the fallout from Hurricane Sandy. So natural disasters, the climate change, that whole discussion around kind of how are cities preparing for this environmental catastrophe and future catastrophes that are coming about. Specifically, kind of in this site-based location of Baltimore. For those that are not familiar with Baltimore or not even from the United States, Baltimore is kind of this, it's a Rust Belt city in America, kind of post-industrial, aging infrastructure. We have one of the main attractions is kind of the Bay region. And so with that, of course, with natural disasters, the immediate thing that comes to mind is flooding and kind of the issues around water management. However, when you look at the greater extent of Baltimore, the harbor and kind of the bay, the water region is only one component of that. The general infrastructure of the city and kind of the built environment is all row homes, so it creates an interesting canvas to kind of think about natural disasters and how the city is preparing. My work specifically kind of focused in my backyard in this neighborhood called McKeldrey Park in East Baltimore, which is not located at all on the harbor, but kind of landlocked by all these kind of developments, industrial parks, hospitals, and et cetera. It was kind of interesting to compare kind of these global efforts that are happening around climate change preparations and kind of natural disasters, and then focusing particularly on this one community, which did not fit the norm as far as like on the coast and on the water, and had many other different issues to address, such as heat, stormwater runoff, and the host of health problems and everything else that kind of came from that. The neighborhood, as well, as you can see, it looks kind of like a hurricane actually went through. But it was, I would say, a premier kind of environmental justice community. So it kind of disinvested low-income, mixed minorities, incoming Hispanic and Latino populations. It was an interesting case study, and as the work progresses, you'll see of all these different issues kind of all colliding around one point, and then my focus particularly around kind of this environmental scene. So in addressing that and kind of going with the design process and what a social designer does is the first kind of step in approaching this issue and approaching climate change within this community was really kind of research on getting to know the place, which was somewhat easy to some extent because I lived in the neighborhood, but also taking that objective stance and stepping back and kind of realizing what is happening at face value, but thinking deeper about some of these social issues and other causes that kind of creates the condition which the neighborhood currently is. So getting to know the place, the people, and then also what is currently happening as far as different initiatives. In this one community, there's 12 churches that play a huge role in kind of the development and just overall social discussion within in the neighborhood, the political landscape between community associations and nonprofits working in the sphere, and also kind of the history of projects, some successful, some not, and kind of dealing with those issues and understanding those issues as I move forward with my project around climate change. So with that, the idea that kind of came to mind in synthesizing all this research and hopefully streamlining all these processes was realizing that there's a lot of these environmental organizations doing work in Baltimore, particularly in this community, and a lot of them have overlapping missions, overlapping statements, and they're all trying to accomplish this kind of environmental message that in itself lends itself to kind of climate adaptation and a longer discussion around climate change. But the problem that was happening was the residents themselves, going back to the people, were often getting approached just as many times, 38 times, whatever, as many times as the organizations wanted about weatherization, about green roofs, about permeable pavements, and kind of all these different strategies where they were being approached so many times that just in the sheer number, they were kind of being turned off and just like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. So the idea was to develop this kind of climate resilient block initiative within the community. And on a block by block basis, kind of walk through all of these things, working with all the partner organizations to try out all these climate adaptation and mitigation techniques, streamline that process, and then measure kind of the impact and where processes could be improved so that it was working on this very hyper-local context rather than kind of all these different organizations swooping in and working out. So in the research, then led to this concept, and then finally to act on it or to start prototyping it. So working with a bunch of residents who were very behind this idea and really wanted to kind of own this environmental pilot within the neighborhood. One of the first activities we did was just kind of a block cleanup around the block. So the litter and dumping is, of course, an issue very as often in some of these communities. So one of the things, I don't know if you can see the image here. So this is an abandoned lot. What you can't see here are some planters. So this used to actually be a community garden. But the person who was taking care of it and maintaining it kind of stepped away from the community when funding ran out. So it became overgrown. It attracted rats. The rats then or you could argue the rats attracted trash or the trash attracted the rats. But it became kind of this eyesore as well as kind of a detriment to the surrounding neighbors. As well as health issues and stuff like that. So the first activity of cleaning this area up and trying to change it was hugely supported by the residents as far as ownership in such a way that they actually ended up cooking us hot breakfast by the day that we're doing it. And for any of you that have done kind of community service or any type of volunteer work, hot breakfast for a volunteer day is major. It's huge. So it was kind of an amazing experience to see what all that was happening. So from kind of prototyping and acting, you also start learning lessons about how the project should possibly move forward and kind of the next iteration of what's going on, as well as kind of now completely immersed in the political landscape and kind of organizational landscape in the neighborhood. Myself, as someone who was really championing kind of this initiative and wanting to see it took place, as well as realizing my constraints that funding and my timeline in the neighborhood was limited by the fellowship, realized that the strategy and kind of this implementation goals would take much longer than what I originally expected, just kind of working through permits and working through city agencies as well as other departments. So realizing that and thinking more about kind of what else can be accomplished or what is another way this project can manifest within the community, and thinking even back about my own background in the built environment and architecture, my own biases kind of approaching this problem. So I started thinking other ways, and possibly the built environment was not the only solution. And then also kind of witnessing this experience with the community, or participating in this experience with the community, realizing that really the people are the quintessential factor to kind of all of this work. And that sounds kind of redundant. I mean, human-centered design and everything like that. But in thinking about that and applied to climate change during a natural disaster or during kind of this longer range plan around climate change, the greatest asset for communities, regardless of income and socioeconomic status, is the people themselves, not necessarily the built environment. So thinking about that and kind of shifting the focus, I switched from this environmental lens to this discussion around kind of social resilience. So how can you build the social cohesion and inclusiveness within the community in hopes that instead of necessarily an organization coming in and trying to champion a project, or myself included, the project would be championed and owned completely by the residents. So in thinking about that and trying to okay, how do we foster the social capital in the community and building upon the other initiatives that are already happening, as well as trying to leverage all of that and make sure that the residents and community stakeholders are represented, that transitioned, and then also thinking graphic design and also what can I accomplish in a year, that's transitioned into this idea of the McKeldry Park Star, which is a newspaper that is written by residents for residents of the neighborhood. This by no means is anything innovative, but when you think of a newspaper not just as an information outlet, but as a way to build social cohesion, things start changing as far as the approach and kind of the tactics about what's going on. The community itself had never actually had kind of a newsletter for the community or a newspaper. So it was, And their thoughts when this idea was initially approached was it would be an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper folded in half, a community calendar on one side, and a letter from the president of the community association on the other. When you, kind of the background and knowledge that I had, as well as the design community and printing and all that other stuff, we were able to provide 24 pages of newsprint that we could pass out in mass, 3,000 copies to the community, to kind of leverage what was going on, as well as get the community voice and residents kind of introduced to what's happening, but also hopefully empower them to kind of move forward on that. So our process with that was working intensively with different residents, community organizations, and everything else, trying to make sure that there was an equal share of voice and kind of opinion on what was happening. Our editorial boards and kind of the entire process was very open source as far as anyone could contribute and anyone had a say. With that, there was a lot of residents that, of course, didn't have really any background in journalism and kind of writing and other things that we somehow layered in through classes and kind of just going through the process in various iterations. So what that allowed us to do was start opening the community and publishing it in a way that really opened it up to community groups as far as if they had picnics and neighborhood events. Allowed us to have residents, if they wanted to sponsor a basketball league or if they thought that the basketball court needed improvement, it allowed them to kind of have a voice in an op-ed in a way that the community itself never really had the opportunity to, or had often the preconceived notion of what the neighborhood was because of its disinvestment or low income status, was changed from this negative stereotype to something that was much more positive. As well as it illuminated the stories of some of the residents and some of the struggles, the day-to-day for some of these, as the day-to-day in the neighborhood. This gentleman here, Mr. Perry, recently just got out of 30 years of incarceration. His struggles in trying to find a job and homelessness really opened kind of, and he ended up writing a piece for a kind of an ongoing piece with the newspaper, kind of opened that discussion of empathy. It's like my neighbor, your neighbor, we're all in this together. How can we talk about it and how can we move together collectively? The other thing, kind of going to this visualization status and how that was going on, is we started not just accepting written material, but also kind of drawings and maps, which as a designer and kind of as any outsider going into a community, when we assess a situation or when we do our initial research, it's always entertaining because we always like map out, well, this is where the closest park is, or this is where the school or the church is. So obviously, because all of these areas are distributed and kind of far away, they obviously need a green space right here. When you open the conversation to drawing and kind of this other means of expression, you start getting really interesting conclusions about the neighborhood and kind of what is important and what is not important, which changes the perception that outsiders often kind of go into a situation with. So the visualization and kind of, as well, kind of a community that's not necessarily fully literate in some cases, it opened up that conversation in a way that allowed those people to participate, once again, kind of contributing to this goal of kind of social inclusiveness around social resilience. Another thing we tried to rethink and redo, and it's been through some iterations, is thinking about kind of the handoff. So typically when you have something like this, it's kind of secluded in a box on the side of a street in the United States, or in a community you might mail off the newsletters. One thing that we really got around and kind of got behind is actually having the residents pass out the newspapers to other residents so that they could begin conversations on the street. But once again, you kind of build that day-to-day face value with people, kind of saying, oh, we're all in this, we're doing this collectively. This is what's happening within the community. So here are some images, some shopping carts and stuff filled to the brim with newspapers as we do our Saturday pass out and kind of engage the entire community at once, door to door, knocking on people, and just having the kind of frank discussion on what's going on and what's happening. So through this process and kind of the lessons learned for me is, and I mean kind of also within the line of social design, is these changing definitions and kind of preconceived notions of what we imagine, in my case, a community to be, as well as other ways to kind of, how does this relate to climate change, and like the threads, I ended up in a place I would not imagine I would have started off as. So in the discussion of like, what is a community, when I first initiated, whenever anybody said like, what is a neighborhood or who represents a neighborhood, the immediate thought is a series of residents or the community leaders or maybe some organizations. But through the paper and kind of the process, we expanded that definition and kind of understood that there's a large part of community and people within a community that are not necessarily the first to mind. So this is a list of kind of, and the list might give the wrong interpretation because the list gets shorter as you go from issue to issue. The side note, the other great thing about doing a newspaper is the iterative nature of it is it changes every issue, so we can understand kind of the adoption and the different techniques around this engagement. So with this, the expanded definition of community started including different schools, different teachers and stakeholders, actually expanding even to people who are currently incarcerated or kind of removed from the community. And kind of one of the things that we started doing was actually passing out newspapers to the local prisons and jails so that people that are currently behind bars, in some cases, can still understand what's happening. And then also, when they do transition out, it's something that they can kind of work with and kind of understand what's happening. Sustainability, that's the other big opportunity. Design entrepreneurship is one thing about it. But in thinking in terms of a paper, which most people and even myself argue that print media is dead, like what is the long-term goal for this, or what is the long-term impact and kind of catalyst for change? Right now, the paper is also sponsored by a grant. So we're looking, of course, at different advertising techniques and stuff, but also understanding this project that it doesn't necessarily need to last forever. If it could act as a catalyst for that initial contact or that initial conversation that then would lead to something else, then maybe it has accomplished its goal. So kind of through this continual iterative process of each issue, we're looking at different support and also just kind of reevaluating if the newspaper is actually needed within the community, which is a kind of a weird tangent to think about as a designer or as any kind of practitioner in the space, because you plan for the long term, you plan for like permanent change, but if this is just a spark that kind of initiates the other changes, that might have an overall greater impact. The other thing about kind of scalability that goes to question, and that many of you are familiar about, is maybe this newspaper is one neighborhood. We don't necessarily want this newspaper to change and kind of grow to a system of one organizational newspaper in Baltimore, because there's already a newspaper doing that. So what if instead of scaling in mass and kind of accumulating different principles and different jurisdictions, it becomes something where each neighborhood kind of can then open up and have their own community newspaper, own community kind of machine, community news machine, that then can kind of cross-reference with each other and start creating, so from this organizational perspective to this ecosystem within Baltimore. So that's about it. Like, just kind of thinking about the sustainability and these different scalability, as well as just kind of how is it contextually appropriate within the community. So we strive to really kind of emphasize this idea of collaboration amongst residents and organizations and different stakeholders, funders, and everybody, but also empower the people that are currently not heard or kind of left out of the equation or often just glossed over because of preconceived notions from outsiders.